Thank you, Suzanne, for the gift of your music. I want to tell you today about Joan. Joan was a great boss, just great. She was the publisher of this local coupon magazine in Pennsylvania, and her being the publisher, that made me the assistant publisher, which was a title she let me invent. Sometimes she would give me a task, like laying out an ad, and I'd say, Joan, how do you want me to do this? And she'd say, I don't care how you do it, just do it. I once asked Joan for a raise, and the entire conversation went like this. I said, Joan, can I have more money? She said, how much? I told her, and she thought about it for a second. She said, fine, pay yourself. And what I loved about working for Joan was that even though she was abrupt, like I'd call the office and she'd answer and say, what? She treated me like I was a person, like a human being. She saw me. She didn't treat this coupon magazine that she owned like it was the meaning of life. Some of it was drudgery, no doubt. We had to do it. We didn't have to like it. She didn't make me pretend I had to like it. It just all felt so honest working there. And so surprisingly, I had a lot of fun. I really loved working for her. One Friday, when I hadn't been there that long, I asked to leave early, and I was a little nervous because I didn't have a good reason. It wasn't like a doctor's appointment or a court subpoena. I just wanted to go see my mom and dad before rush hour. They lived in New Jersey. So I said, Joan, can I leave early? She said, why? I told her. She said, why are you still here? Get out of here. I said, well, I know we have stuff to do. The mag publication is coming up this month. And she said, remember, always, nothing we do here is of consequence. Nothing we do here is of consequence. Now, can you imagine, I had never had a boss talk to me about the business that way. Because all the bosses I had before Joan, they seemed to believe that everything we did here was of consequence. Everything. The anthropologist David Graeber from the London School of Economics, he argues that more than work itself, being forced to pretend that busy work matters is eating away at modern workers' sense of pride. It's undermining their ability to live meaningful, authentic lives. The idea that we're supposed to spend every second of the day being maximally productive, he says, quote, has become so normalized that members of the public feel indignant if they see transit workers lounging on the job. Think about that. Like, what do you want the bus driver to do? Like, pretend to be driving while at the depot? Spend this 15-minute interval polishing all the mirrors even once they're already polished? Like what? Can we not stand still for a minute? I've heard that people from Europe are surprised when they get to America and see that our cashiers don't have chairs to sit in. Like if you're not standing, you're not working, you're required to go home with aching feet every day, or else you're not virtuous. Give the cashiers a chair, let them sit. They're not moving. But this idea, says Graeber, is new. This is not natural to humans, and it is, he argues, a form of morality. Historically, he writes, human work patterns have taken the form of intense bursts of energy followed by rest. Farming, for instance, he says, is generally an all-hands-on-deck mobilization around the planting and the harvest, with the off-seasons occupied by minor projects. Large projects such as building houses, raising barns, preparing for feasts take the same form. This is typical, he says, of how humans have always worked, until recently. Graeber notes that even in medieval times, work was largely unsupervised. Serfs just did the harvest. It either got harvested or it didn't, right? No one was looking. And they worked, believe it or not, far less than people do today. Our impression of medieval serfs on the feudal manor is wrong. They usually only worked about 6 months out of the year, and even then they only worked about half of the day. Half the day was plenty. It included nap time. Under a tree, 2 naps if it was a plague time happening. Once the harvest was in, you weren't required to pretend to keep swinging a scythe all day and look busy. You went home. But Graeber says the proliferation of domestic clocks and pocket watches that coincided with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, with that time came to be seen as a finite property, to be budgeted and spent, much like money. And these new time-telling devices allowed a worker's time to be chopped up into uniform units that could be bought and sold. It was no longer trading of labor, it was trading of time. The change, he says, was moral as well as technological. One began to speak of spending time, killing time, wasting time. And through the 18th and 19th centuries, the episodic style of working with periods of rest was starting to be seen as something of like moral depravity. Methodist preachers began exhorting the husbandry of time. Time management became a virtue. The poor were now blamed, writes Graeber, for spending their time recklessly, as if just like existing can be a reckless act, for being irresponsible with their time as they were with their money. And so we began buying and selling not labor, but shares of attention and life. And the new morality emerged that during working hours, workers' time was not their own. They had no right to make decisions, no right to spend any of their boss's time on self-improvement or self-comfort, to show anything less than total commitment and enthusiasm for enriching one's employer. Most societies throughout history, Graeber writes, would never have imagined that a person's time could belong to their employer. But today it's considered perfectly natural for free citizens of democratic societies to rent out a third or more of their day. Now, at the previous job I'd had before Joan hired me and rescued me, I had spent the better part of a year keeping up the charade that I was a fully invested employee in an encyclopedia company that I worked for as an editor, and that providing a quality encyclopedia experience for our users was my highest hope for the next 5 years. Despair began to grow in me as I started to believe that that might be true. The office had no windows. My desk faced a wall. Entire days would go by where I wouldn't speak to another human, and in retrospect, I can't remember what it was that we actually did there. I missed bartending. I began to regret having gone to college. The plant on my desk died, which for some reason reminded me of a canary in a coal mine. The happiest day of that entire job was the day that the fire alarm went off. And for a few brief moments, not only did I get to evacuate the building, I held out hope that the encyclopedia company might actually burn down. Like Bartleby the scrivener, I began to do less and less work. For weeks, nobody noticed, which only increased my conviction that nothing I did there was of consequence. For the record, it wasn't. Finally, one day I was called into the manager's office. "Are you going to improve your performance?" he asked. And in that moment, I had a full-blown existential crisis. "No," I said. "Sarah, are you quitting?" he asked. "No," I said, because I knew better. "Am I firing you?" he asked. "Are you asking me?" I asked. "No," he said. And then he fired me, which made that the second happiest day at the encyclopedia company. And then I went to work for Joan, where the office work was exactly the same, but I got treated like a person. If I got done the invoicing early, she didn't require that I stick around for an extra 3 hours, pretending to click on various accounts. I left. David Graeber writes that there's little more demoralizing than waking up 5 days a week and pretending to perform a task that one believes is a waste of time. Being forced to play along with the pretense is inherently demoralizing because it's a game of make-believe, not of one's own making. Of course, he says, of course the soul cries out. It is an assault on the very foundation of self. A human being unable to have an impact on the world ceases to exist. As Unitarian Universalists, we believe in the inherent dignity of individuals, and we can trace that phrase back to an 1838 lecture from Minister William Ellery Channing called Self-Culture. Now, Channing was arguably the most important Unitarian minister of all time, though I know some people that would fight me on that. And in this lecture, he argues that not only are people worth more than the labor they do for their employer, but that the best thing a person can do in this life is not to work harder, but to work on themselves. He writes, "The common notion has been that the mass of people need no other culture than is necessary to fit them for their various trades. But the ground of a man's culture," he says, "lies in his nature, not in his calling. His powers are to be unfurled on account of their inherent dignity, not their outward direction. In other words, we should strive to improve ourselves, not because it's profitable for someone else, but because our humanity depends on it. You are more than your job. I have expressed my interest in the mass of people," he writes, "and this is founded not on their usefulness to the community, so much as on what they are in themselves. A rational moral being cannot be converted into a mere instrument of others' gratification," he says, "without doing infinite wrong." You know, it was once believed that the rise in technology would mean shorter workdays for all of us, that with the help of machines from the Industrial Revolution, we'd only have to work a few hours a day. So here we are. That has not come to pass. With the invention instead of a stifling new morality, we now have serious arguments in our society about whether the poor deserve handouts like welfare, and whether or not people should have to prove when they're hungry that they're actually looking for work before they'll be allowed to have food stamps. This is a morality, and I would argue that the greater part of meaningful human activities are those which don't generally turn a profit and still need to be done. I don't believe we all need to be working all the time. Some of us are elderly, others disabled, others engaged in caring for their children or caring for their elders. Some of us are engaged in studies, in volunteering, going to church, living our lives, serving our communities, checking in on our neighbors. These things don't generate profit or pay. I believe that the decline in church participation among young people is due more in part to the decline of free time in an overworked society than to a sudden, mysterious lack of interest in life and death. Last time I checked, these are still issues. Now, Channing says he understands why some people might believe that the masses just aren't interested in improving themselves. They're just not interested in spending time on self-reflection or serious thinking. But, he says, he just can't believe that, because a portion of the divine fire is given to all. From this, we have our modern Unitarianism today. He says we have a noble power of acting on, determining, and forming ourselves. This, he writes, is a fearful and glorious endowment. It is the ground of human responsibility. Our highest responsibility, he says, is the care every man owes to himself, to the unfolding and perfecting of his nature. We set aside time on Sundays to think about these things. But, he writes, and I'm delighted by this quote, "Let it be remembered that little is to be gained simply by coming to this place once a week and giving up the mind for an hour to be wrought upon by a teacher, unless what we hear is made a part of ourselves. By conscientious reflection, very little permanent good is received." For Unitarian Universalists, this hour we spend together is sacred, and yet it is not the only sacred hour of our lives. Empowered by the love we find here, we transform ourselves and serve our world. Self-culture is religious, says Channing. When we look into ourselves, we discover powers which link us with this outward, visible, finite, ever-changing world. As Emerson wrote, religion is experience passed through the fire of our thought. We forge our own faith from our self-culture. I am reminded of the Stephen Jay Gould quote, that I'm somehow less interested in the weight and convolutions of Einstein's brain than in the near certainty that people of equal talent have lived and died in cotton fields and sweatshops. There is a fragment of the divine fire in all of us. We value individual human lives enough to believe that anybody can have a rich spiritual life, and everybody should. We are more than what we produce in a day. We are those many complicated, beautiful, complex experiences that make up a human life. Amen. Blessed be. Thank you. Thank you. We sustain this community and its good works and this sacred hour through the sharing of our resources, our time, our energy, our talents, our ideas, and our money. Beneath your seats, as last week, are pledge cards. If you haven't pledged, you should do that now, and I'm going to tell you why, and I'm going to be as honest as Joan. We do not have enough money to pay for stuff next year. We've made fantastic progress. This church is so healthy, this lively, growing, strong, vibrant church. And the reality of it is, if we do not bridge the gap in our budget, there will be Sundays next year when there is no music. Take a second, think about that. There will be no music. The other cuts are going to come from the RE program, where we educate our children, the next generation, where we foster the self-culture that makes better citizens of this world. The effects of what we do here ripple outward into society. If you have not pledged, please consider doing so. The offering will now be gratefully received.